So my name is Nelson Cummins. I am the Communities and Campaigns Officer at the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. And thanks for joining us this Black History Month talk today. Before I pass over to Dr Christine Whyte, I just wanted to say a brief bit about Black History Month in Scotland. So in 2001, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, back when we were the Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance, coordinated the first Black History Month programme in Scotland. And 20 years on, the programme continues to grow with partners across the community, voluntary and public sectors contributing dozens of events every October, including City Arts Centre and Museums Galleries Edinburgh. And we're really grateful for their continued support in putting these talks on. So if you're interested in finding out more about what's in the programme this year, I'll drop a link in the chat to our Black History Month website. There's lots of exciting things going on, from talks, concerts, workshops, film screenings, exhibitions, and many more things, both happening online and in person. But I will introduce our speaker for tonight. So Dr Christine Whyte is going to deliver a talk that explores some of the life stories of African children who were brought to Scotland as part of the broader engagement of Scots in the expansion of the British Empire. Children, many of them redeemed from slavery, taught, guided, and educated Scots about and through Africa and African languages. This talk will illuminate more about the lives of African child migrants in Scotland in the late 19th century. Dr Christine Whyte is a lecturer in global history at the University of Glasgow. She is currently a British Academy / Wolfson Foundation Fellow, working on a project titled Recaptured Childhoods, which traces the lives and experiences of children liberated from the slave trade in the 19th century. And so that's Christine Whyte, after you.
Hi, Nelson. Yeah, thank you so much, Nelson, and thank you so much to CRER. It's always such a pleasure to join Black History Month Scotland every year and to learn new things and to meet new people. And now we're kind of like virtually in Edinburgh, which is like a very exciting way of doing this. I'm actually in Glasgow, but we can pretend that we're in the capital city. And people are always actually in Glasgow. People are always so generous with the comments and questions, but the capital city has to be involved in. And so I'm a lecturer in global history here at the University of Glasgow. And so my research is really focused on transnational links and connections. But my focus has always been on the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire. And my research has looked at the kind of abolition of slavery in Sierra Leone in West Africa, where slavery was only legally abolished by the British colonial government in 1928, and across Liberia and other areas of West Africa. But today I wanted to talk about unaccompanied African children who came to Scotland in the late 19th century. And just as a warning, I'm talking about the history of race and slavery and empire in the 19th century, and the sources for the time use racist language and terms that are upsetting and offensive. And some of this material is very painful because it deals with slavery. And I wanted to give a little bit of historical background and context to the 19th century by briefly talking about the 18th century and children who were brought from Africa, Asia, and the Americas in that period. And so enslaved children were brought to Scotland throughout the 18th century until the Joseph Knight case established that slavery wasn't legal under Scottish law. This was a practice of enslavers to bring children to work as domestic servants, as page boys in Scottish houses. And we have some small pieces of documentary evidence about how that happened. So this is a letter from William Colquhoun to Archibald Patterson, a merchant in Glasgow, from around 1775. And He was first mate on board a slave ship, and he's talking about a girl only 12 years old who's on the ship with him, and he wants to send her to Glasgow to work as a domestic servant in the house of his brother-in-law. The girl he's talking about, he refers to as being from the Dimbia River, which we now is known as the Scarces River, and it's located in modern Sierra Leone. And that area was the site of a number of trading networks. The nearby Ile de Los was home to a lot of British traders, and especially Factory Town, which was dominated by the infamous slave trader Miles Barber. And further south, there were a number of Portuguese traders and Portuguese African families in that region, where Portuguese traders had married into local families, and they controlled the trade in that area. And at the same time, there's a whole network of merchants who, Fula merchants, who were sort of gradually expanding their control with longer range trading routes over the Sahara. So this girl, this 12-year-old girl who'd been abducted by Colquhoun, who was planning to traffic to a household near the Tron Gate in Glasgow, had been born and lived in this sort of cosmopolitan trading hub linked to the Sahara deserts by Muslim traders, long-distance Muslim traders, to British and the British colonies in America and the Caribbean, and through Portugal to the Portuguese Empire. And Colquhoun notes that she spoke good English, and potentially she learned this after she was abducted, but she may also have known it through exposure to British traders in that region. And so she would have spoken multiple languages. The letter he wrote was probably written from the Industry, which was a Bristol-based ship, and it made the journey from West Africa to the Upper James River in Virginia. And so it's unknown what happened to this girl. Even her name is unknown. Perhaps she ended up in Glasgow, perhaps in Virginia. But this story gives you a very partially told, reveals the kinds of very long and traumatic journeys that children made to get to these Scottish households. And then once in Scotland, of course, we have evidence of children resisting this process. So this is an advertisement from the Glasgow Journal describing a boy about 16 years of age. He's named Boyd, presumably renamed Boyd by his enslavers. It says that he has a small mark or country mark on one side of his face. A country mark would have been a scarification or a type of tattoo that was given upon initiation, so upon the kind of rites of passage of a boy becoming a man in Africa. And so this boy who's been renamed Boyd was in West Africa long enough to go through that process, if it was indeed a country mark, before he was brought to Scotland and trafficked into slavery. To give you a little idea, and also to link a little bit to the National Museum for Scotland, I took a look for a West Central African mask that shows the kind of a sort of idealized, stylized version of the kind of country marks or facial markings. And this would have been used during boys' initiation ceremonies. So we don't know where Boyd came from. We don't know even where he went to. But this gives you some idea of what they're talking about in these advertisements, and how we can sort of find some visuals really from these African artistic works. As well as enslaved African children, you also find enslaved American Indian children and runaway advertisements. There are actually 3 advertisements for the same boy. So here's the shortest and clearest one, and he has a very distinctive feature that one set of his eyelashes were white. And so the 3 advertisements were placed seeking this same boy from 1765 to 1766. So it's not only children from Africa, but children from around the Atlantic. And children also, African children also came to Britain with free status at the same time that slavery and the slave trade was still legal in the British Empire. As I mentioned before, European traders would marry into these powerful West African trading families to secure their positions on the coast, and they had to make deals with influential rulers. One of the ways that alliances were forged between European traders and African traders was through this kind of wardship system for children. So we're all sort of familiar with the custom of elite British families to send their children, some as young as 7 years old, away from the family home to attend school. And so in a similar way, African merchants and political leaders were interested in sending their children to Britain to gain an advantage in these trading relationships, to learn English, to learn about British society and culture. And this is an example of one such ward. Fanfila Yenge, who was also known as Jenkins, was a wealthy trader in Gone, close to the Moki River in Liberia. And in 1803, he sent his son, who became known as Tom Jenkins, with a Scottish ship surgeon on board a slave ship. And Tom Jenkins was brought to Scotland for education, so as a free boy. But unfortunately, James Swanson died not long after they arrived here. Tom Jenkins still attended school, had a marvelous facility for languages, and became a schoolmaster, and eventually applied to a missionary society. He wanted to go back to Liberia, where he came from, or he wanted to go to Saint-Domingue. He wanted to go to Haiti, which was newly free after the revolution. The British Foreign Missionary Society sent him, though, to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, very far from where he wanted to be, where he established a school to teach Malagasy children there in 1823. So Tom had never been enslaved. He wasn't abducted. His father sent him sort of freely, but it's sort of interesting to think, or I think useful to think about how his experience as a Black child in Scotland might have been shaped by the ways in which the public had read and understood the advertisements from a generation before he arrived. He talks about experiencing discrimination when he applies to leave Scotland. He suffered from discrimination in his career as a school teacher. And finally, also children in the British Empire were also kind of pawns in political struggles. So, I mean, one famous example is the Maharaja Duleep Singh. He's sometimes said to have been rescued or adopted. And so there's always this kind of euphemistic language around children. But in fact, he was kidnapped. He was forced into exile in Scotland. And so that's just to give you a kind of backdrop to what I'm talking about in the 19th century, is that it's not something new exactly that children were brought to Scotland from other places, which were being sort of touched by the British Empire. There are all these different sort of strands of history, of children's history, of this kind of migration. So I'm going to start by looking at two objects, which were what kind of led me into thinking about this history and these children. And the first is the gravestone of a child. And this Louise Yeoman, who's a BBC's radio producer, asked me if I knew anything about this gravestone, which is in the Grange Cemetery in Edinburgh. And so this photograph I took when I went to look at it. And you can see it reads, Tom, an African slave boy, died at Edinburgh, April 13th, 1884, age 13, redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, erected by the children of the Rose Hall UP Church. And so Louise Yeoman had looked into this, and she'd found that Tom had been sort of informally adopted by two Scottish missionaries, Joseph and Eliza Clark, along with several other children from West Central Africa, while they were working as missionaries in the Congo. But she didn't very little kind of beyond that. And so we have this grave marker. And the second object that kind of drew my attention to this history, this is it's a photograph, and it's held in the archives of the Regions Beyond Missionary Union, which are held at the University of Edinburgh. And I've been looking at these archives for something completely different, but this photograph taken in the studio of W.B. Anderson, Union Street, Aberdeen, caught my eye. It's obvious it's around the same date as Tom's gravestone. And there was something about it that made me think of Tom and thinking about these children and how it had come about that they were in Scotland. So the obvious place to start was the Regions Beyond Missionary Union, which was a missionary society founded by Henry Grattan Guinness, nephew of the founder of the Guinness Brewing Company. In 1872, Guinness established an East London Training Institute for Home and Foreign Missions, and he co-founded that with Thomas Barnardo, who established a home for children nearby, the famous Barnardo's Children's Home. And that first student of the institute was actually from India and South Asia, Joshua Chauriapa, and the institute grew very quickly, and they moved to Bow in East London. And it was only after the death of the Scottish missionary Dr. David Livingston in present-day Zambia that there was this kind of inspiration to extend the mission activity into Africa. And so in 1877, Guinness established the Livingston Inland Mission, with this goal of establishing mission stations in West Central Africa. And this was intended to kind of honor the memory of David Livingston. And the first permanent settlement was at Palabala, where the king Kayampaka had donated land for a house and garden for a missionary called Henry Craven, who was one of the first from this society to go to this region. So he's joined by other male missionaries, Johnson, McCarrigo, Clark, McCall, Harvey, and Lancey in 1879. And Craven records that very quickly, quote, the nucleus of a school was gathered. Some children were ransomed and adopted, others sent by their parents. And so this was very much how the missionaries intended to grow this mission. And hopefully their aim was to convert people to Christianity. So when Craven talks about ransoming and adopting children, he's talking about redeeming children from slavery or from forms of debt bondage. So purchasing enslaved children to come and live, and then adopting them, meaning having them come and live on this mission station. And those children were accompanied by children who were freely sent by their parents to experience this new and different form of education that was being offered in the region. And often local elites were very interested in what the missionaries had to offer, particularly in the opportunity for their children to learn English or French or German. So to give you an example here of a child redeemed from slavery by this mission, this is Bateku, standing on the right as we're looking at him. He's dressed in white. He was known as Mr. Richard's boy, meaning he would have worked specifically for the missionary Richards as a kind of personal servant. And Richards in turn would have been particularly responsible for Bateku. So you can, Bateku is described as a Lukulela boy. Lukulela is a town now in the southern bank of the Congo River, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. near where the mission was situated. But this was not his original home, and he describes how he came to be at Lukolela. So this is Bateku's own account of his enslavement. It was in one of those fights that I was captured and made a slave. The people who captured me got me a long way from my town and parents, though I do not now remember my father or mother. These people sold me to some other people. They cut some of these marks that are on my body. After living here some time, I was again sold and carried to the river Lulanga. Here they cut marks in my body. So this is these country marks. So the marks of identification of being part of a particular group. So this is part of the kind of incorporation of someone into a new society or group. And he says, after a while, the white men came and now have come to live at their town. So from the perspective of Bateku, this final exchange where the missionary Richards purchased them was probably not too dissimilar from the other exchanges that, or the other sort of instances of trafficking that had happened to them. He was again purchased for either a sum of money or some goods. He doesn't specify. His friend leaning there in the log, Latumba, who was also called Jack, gives a very similar story of his very long journey to the mission station, saying he was born far away inland at a town called Lakuba, many days' journey. And so he remembers his mother, he remembers his father, and he remembers this conflict that they were caught in, and where a number of the children and women were captured and then trafficked into slavery. And he says that he thinks he was sold for about 10 brass rods, which was a form of currency used at the time. So this is how children would come to this mission station, the mission in Palabala, again, sort of mirroring the ways in which African children had come to Britain in the 18th century through this trafficking process, and then sort of in the end being kind of servants, sort of domestic servants on the mission station, or being sent by their parents or guardians. So here's, this gives you a kind of idea what it looked like. This is a later image from the Congo Balolo mission, established by Guinness's son in 1888. And it shows John McKittrick and his wife Dora, and with the children that attended the mission school and probably lived on the mission station. And in the back, there are two adult graduates or teachers. So unfortunately, only the names of the McKittricks have been recorded for this photograph. But children like this at the mission stations went to the mission school, and they were educated in Bible studies. And these lessons were conducted in English, but also gradually in local languages as the missionaries were able to learn them. So the children learned English, but very importantly, the missionaries learned local languages from the children. And alongside this, what they would call literary education became increasingly popular at these mission stations to give children an industrial education, which is also a term used in Britain for the education given to the poor and working classes. And this is education in trades. And so these are two sort of early 20th century photographs showing different kinds of training: carpentry, brickmaking, blacksmithing. And these skills were put to use to build the mission stations and reproduce mission written materials. So you can see the photograph of the group of children standing there is labeled as our native printers. So these are children that were helping to reproduce written mission materials for distribution. So that's the Regions Beyond Missionary Union and how children came to be at these mission stations and what they were doing. So the question is, who's in this photograph taken in Aberdeen? Now the archivist who put this photograph in the file thought that maybe it was Henry Craven. So you can see there's a question mark. Henry Craven with 2 African boys that it brought to England in 1881. The archivist's also not sure where Aberdeen is, apparently. So it's in the summer of 1881, Craven did come to the UK on furlough, and he brought with him 3 children from the Congo region, 2 boys and a little girl. But this is Henry Craven, who does look very similar to the man in the photograph, because a lot of these missionary men with their enormous beards do look very similar. And he came with children that he brought, unaccompanied African children, in 1881. The boys were named Ndambi and Pukamoni, but were given Christian names when they were baptized, Francis and Robert Walker. The girl was named Launda, but she was not considered to be ready for baptism yet, and the missionaries nicknamed her Topsy. And she was actually the daughter of the king who had originally granted the mission land. And so she and her father was quite attached to her and had sent her for education, but she returned to her family. And so the children that Henry Craven brought to the UK, they spent their time helping him to write a grammar of the Fiot language and to prepare translations of mission publications. And they later translated a Kikongo grammar book from Latin into English with Guinness. So they were assistants in this language work that the missionaries were involved in. And I think this is one of the key reasons that missionaries were so interested in bringing African children to Britain. And there's quite a strong connection between the translation work done by African mission children and slavery. By traveling to the UK, or by bringing these children to the UK, the children could acquire the necessary English language skills to be able to compose grammars and dictionaries of their first languages. Most of these children would have had several first languages, as well as to perform translations and to help with writing children's stories. So this is this image is of George Greenfull and his wife Patience Rosanna Edgerly. And he was a member of the Baptist Missionary Society. And he took 8 children with him from a mission school on board his ship, which is called the Peace, when he went sort of exploring for him a new area of the Congo River in 1885. And the children had been enslaved or trafficked, or they were the children of people who'd been enslaved. And because of that, they moved across long distances, and they knew multiple languages, and they knew the broader region. And so they could act as interpreters and guides on these voyages undertaken by the missionaries. And one of the children that went with Greenfull on the Peace was called Mantantu Dundulo. And he was an orphan who'd been raised by his uncle, and a missionary called Bentley had visited the village, which was called Lemvo, and was impressed by him. And so sort of brought him into the mission fold and renamed him Lemvo, which literally means of the village of Lemvo. And so this renaming was also extremely common. And Lemvo became one of the most significant translators of the Kikongo language. And so this is him working with Holman Bentley to compile a dictionary and grammar of the Congo language. He's sitting at the desk, and Holman Bentley's standing opposite him. And here he is at work in London on index cards, which they use to compile a list of words for the dictionaries. And opposite him spinning is a girl called Aku, who had also been redeemed, and she worked for the Bentleys. She took care of their baby for them on this trip to the UK. And this drawing with this photograph is titled "The Blind Lexicographer at Work," and that actually refers to both Lemvo and Holman Bentley, because they both lost their eyesight gradually through this work on the dictionary. And I think there's probably a great deal more that could be said. So here's some more images of Lemvo. And a great deal more that could be said about the work or the hidden work that went into creating this sort of plethora of dictionaries and grammars and publications in African languages in the 19th century. So children of the mission, whether they were adopted, whether they were ransomed from slavery or redeemed from slavery, whether they were sent by their parents, they were playing this really vital role in the development of the scholarly study of African languages, in interpretation of biblical scholarship, and bringing them to the UK was facilitating this work, because these long periods in the UK allowed the children to develop their English language skills. And also, as we can see from the example of a coup, the children were of really practical use to the missionary families. So they were working as nannies, as domestic servants. They were taking care of the missionaries' children. And they were also used in this kind of the marketing campaigns of the missionary societies. So Guinness, for example, who founded the missionary society, recounts that, quote, "Many gave the £5 needed to ransom a child. Some dear little ones at Liverpool, who had Latumba to breakfast with them one morning, resolved to invest their little savings for the ransom of such another child. A Scotch family sent £20 for the redemption of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls." So what Guinness is saying is that the children of the mission were kind of, in a way, being used as sort of examples of the good work the mission was doing, and rousing people's sympathy to send donations. But it's interesting that he states that it's Latumba who's sort of roused people's sympathy to send money to redeem children, because she actually was the daughter of the king and quite close to her family. She wasn't redeemed from slavery, and so this is a kind of question mark for me over how they were presenting these children, some of whom indeed had been trafficked, but others who had been sent by their parents willingly. So the mission was kind of building on, or like pulling on, kind of anti-slavery sentiment, sort of highlighting the enslaved origins of some of the children. So, and Lemvo, the sort of last record I can find about him is he's in Morningside in 1905, giving a sort of delivering a sermon to the children of Morningside, presumably about his experiences. So Henry Craven certainly did bring children to Britain with them, and so did the other British missionaries of the inland Livingston mission. And they did that to help the mission work through translation and fundraising. But Henry Craven is not the man in this archive photograph that I found. I eventually found a copy of the picture in a book written by Guinness's wife, Fanny Guinness, and she identifies in the book who he is, and it's Joseph Clark. And that's the same Joseph Clark that brought Tom to Scotland. So Tom from the gravestone at the beginning. Clark actually came from Aberdeen originally, so he might well have been on a visit home for his furlough when the photograph was taken. As you can see, the boys are not named in Guinness's book, which is A New World of Central Africa, and it's freely available on the internet. You can get it on archive.org. So I'm still not 100% sure who the boys were. I did find this photograph, which is of the first students at the Colwyn Bay African Institute in Wales, which was a training school for missionaries established in 1890 by Reverend William Hughes. And that school was open for 2 decades, training African children to be missionaries. And by 1903, there were more than 20 students living there in Colwyn Bay in Wales, from Cameroon, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. But this is the first 4 students in Mukanza, Daniel, Frank, and Kinkas, who are all from the Congo. And to my eye, but I mean, it's not definitive, the boys look like Mukanza and Kinkasa. From the Institute's records, there's very little information about Mukanza, except that he was apparently redeemed from slavery by Hughes for a bale of cloth, that he was trained in printing, and that he learned the entire New Testament by heart. And he traveled with Hughes on lecture tours. So Hughes would give lectures for the Congo alongside Mukanza. And so perhaps he could have been in Aberdeen for that reason. At these lectures, the missionaries would address the crowd about their work, and before the widespread use of magic lanterns, which could project photographs and images, the children would have given this kind of first-hand account of life in the region. So there's even less information about Kinkasa, only that he was apparently found by Hughes near the Bainston mission, and I haven't been able to find much more about them. The 2 other boys are Daniel and Frank. So Daniel is Daniel Harvey, and the only information about him is that he was trained in carpentry. The other boy, though, is Frank Tiva Clark, and there's some contradictory information about him, but he was sort of informally adopted by the Clarks, the same family that had adopted or brought Tom to Scotland. He seems to have joined the Palabala mission around 1885. The Belgian colonial government believed that Joseph Clark had purchased him as a domestic servant for a length of cloth. And he was baptized, Frank Clark, by Joseph Clark around that date. And he came to Colwyn Bay about 3 years later, where he learned to be a wheelwright, and he also studied medicine. He came to Glasgow to study mechanics at that time as well. And it's in Glasgow he may have encountered the famous Thomas Lewis Johnson, who was a man born into slavery in Virginia, who came to Britain in 1876 and wrote a famous autobiography called 28 Years a Slave, and who eventually settled in Bournemouth. And it's from Thomas Lewis Johnson's book, 28 Years a Slave, that we have this photograph of Frank Tiva Clark, where, again, to my eye, he looks like a teenager, and so around the age he would have been either in Wales or in Glasgow. But in 1892, Frank Clark returned to the Congo, and he went to his hometown, and he got a really warm welcome. But he moved on. He established the Akoko mission station, and there he ran a school. And he was accompanied in the Akoko mission station by Vunga, also known as Lena Frederica Clark, who was the adoptive sister of Tom. So this is where the Akoko mission, that blue star is where the Akoko mission station was. And she had lived in Morningside in Edinburgh with Joseph and Eliza Clark's house. And she was a very gifted linguist, and it was a skill that would prove to be pivotal. So here she sits with a white blouse on, and amongst these younger girls. So she lived in Morningside with her other adoptive Congolese siblings, including Tom, who tragically died there in Edinburgh. And she became a very significant figure in the Congo reform movement. So she was a translator and an interviewer and a researcher for Roger Casement, who had traveled to the Congo in 1903 to investigate colonial abuses. Vunga, or Lena Clark, and Frank Tiva Clark both played a really important role in those investigations. They testified before the Commission of Inquiry established by King Leopold. They translated and verified accounts of violence at Ikoko and Bikoro. Frank Clark and Vunga Clark had skills or knew Kikongo, Bobangi, English, French, and Portuguese, and so they were able to translate and interview. And so until very recently, the work of these informants, translators, interviewers, researchers has not received very much attention in comparison with the British journalists and missionaries who campaigned against Belgian rule. But there's sort of more and more work bringing this to light, including Rob Burrows' book, African Testimony in the Movement for Congo Reform. But what struck me about it really was how many of them had gone through this process of informal adoption or ransoming or education, how many had spent periods of time in Britain and Scotland, and then how extraordinary it was that this photograph of a man, this modest gravestone in an Edinburgh graveyard, were linked through all these ties to this extraordinary story of activism and bravery of Lena and Frank Clark in the Congo. So thank you very much. Hope I'm not grossly over time.
Well, thank you, Christine. That was brilliant. No, really interesting.